Let me welcome everybody to the GovTech Week online conference. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope that we have a really nice digital audience. And today we will have a panel discussion, which is data-driven decision-making, balancing between evidence-based policy and surveillance state. I think that the topic is very very interesting and very relevant for the time being of the world, of the technology, and of the whole social structure. So hardly anything runs without data. I think that the data is the new oil, as was titled by The Economist a year or 2 years ago. We see that the rise of the data-driven companies, platforms, even countries, it seems that the data, being the blood in the government's body or a company's body, makes it more agile, more resilient, more open, more entrepreneurial. So today, this panel is dedicated to discuss the extent to which governments should use data. And we have important panelists. I will introduce both panelists right now. We have Ms. Eline Chivot, a senior policy analyst at ITIF, Center for Data Innovation, based in Brussels. Eline focuses on European technology policy issues and on how policy makers can promote digital innovation in the European Union. Prior to joining the Center for Data Innovation, Eline worked for several years in the Netherlands as a policy analyst in the leading think tank, where her work included research projects on defense, security, and economical policy issues. Thank you very much, Eline, for joining us. Very nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and we have the second panelist, Ms. Katarzyna Szymielewicz, lawyer specialized in human rights and technology, co-founder and president of Panoptykon Foundation, and Polish NGO defending human rights in the context of surveillance, advisor to European digital rights. From 2011 to 2016, a member of the Council for Digitization in Poland, advising the government. Since 2015, member of Ashoka International Network of Social Entrepreneurs. Very nice having you, Katarzyna, as well in the panel. Hi.
Thank you for your invitation. Looking forward to discussion.
All right, so why we don't start our discussion? So probably just before we start, the distinction has to be made between the socially charged data and personal data and the rest of the data. Because I think having data, it's good. Even having social data, it's good. Data-driven decision-making is good, and accumulating data is good, but having too much data, probably it's not so good anymore. Somewhere there's a line between data and too much data, which we focus our discussion today. So that's probably the balance, the sweet spot where we could start exploring the topic, exploring the balance. And well, generally, what do you think? What is this good amount of having this data to feed the evidence-based policy, and where this line, the red line, which we should not cross, would start? If I could start from Eline, could you please contribute?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Just real briefly, I'd like to push back a little bit on what you said on data being the new oil. I think the analogy should not necessarily be used the way that it's been. People interpret it to mean that data has become a very valuable commodity in the modern economy. And it's true that data is invaluable, but the analogy with oil is I would say, actually quite flawed. But we can get back to this discussion at another moment, perhaps. I think just to get back to your question on the benefits of data for instance, in policy making, as this is today's discussion, I think this is a no-brainer. New technologies have even made it easier and cheaper to collect and use data, and data leads to better understanding and decision-making among individuals, businesses, governments. Governments agencies are using data to cut costs, to prioritize social services, to keep citizens safe. They can use data to deliver better services to citizens. We've seen with the COVID crisis how it's been increasingly beneficial to be able to harness the power of data sharing between researchers, academics, and companies and governments to be able to find solutions to the crisis. You have a lot of applications and a lot of institutions that are using data to really make things better. Just a couple more examples. The European Space Agency, they deploy satellites equipped with remote sensing technologies to track and analyze changes in the global environment to help forecast weather events like hurricanes and droughts. So there's really, I could go on and on with examples like you can use data for policymaking to promote racial equity, to analyze data with an anti-racism lens, to fight hidden institutional biases in policies and in practices. So you can use data for a lot of positive applications. And governments in this really have to lead by examples. They really can act as a practitioner and help build local data savvy communities, demonstrate the feasibility of different technologies, and encourage public enthusiasm for data-driven innovation. And of course, the problem with many organizations, and especially governments and public sector institutions, is that they've been quite slow to adopt those technologies, and the public sector in particular lags behind in some ways when it comes to really harnessing the potential of data and transitioning towards digital for several reasons. I mean, they're outsourcing digital, or there's a lack of software culture. There's a risk of civil servants not trusting the work of technologies. And back to your point about how much data is too much, or is there some sort of a gray area here, or some sort of a limit? We know that many algorithms, fortunately or unfortunately, this is another discussion. For now, in order to be accurate, they still feed on data quite a bit. So the more data you can have, the more accurate your technology is likely to be. Now, we can get back to that as well later. One important point in saying that is also not just the quantity is important, but the quality of the data is important. So I would say data is good in quantity, but we also have to make sure that it is properly cleaned, that it is properly shared, that it is properly collected in order to really find applications that are accurate and beneficial.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, that's the analogy made by The Economist a couple of years ago with the rise of the big tech companies, especially those big four. But probably, yes, the data is not the new oil. It's something even better. And now, Katarzyna, could we have this balance from your side? Because now it seems that we are talking about data that is not socially charged, or just it's not socially sensitive. I mean, everybody would like to have more data about our, I don't know, crops, climate, pollution, and all the metrics that goes around us, because it's not really sensitive. It's not connected with a personal dimension. But some of the data can be connected with a personal dimension. And I believe that's where the problems might start.
Very true. That's a very good point. This distinction between personal data, as we call it in the legal jargon, and non-personal or statistical data describing the world around us, although the line between the two can be blurred and can be very tricky to distinguish where we are in a specific case. Think, for example, about transportation, cars, engines, to what extent data generated by cars are at the same time data of their users that certainly describe the way the machine is used, the way the machine behaves, and the places where the machine goes, therefore revealing quite a lot of personal information, even if at the beginning we could think or we would wish to think that we are just just collecting data about the engine of the car, for example. Back for a couple of seconds to the oil analogy, I also think it's quite outdated analogy, and we need better ones. But one aspect of this old analogy still resonates with me, which is negative externalities of processing data. Same way you always have negative externalities for the environment, for human beings, for societies of processing oil, too much oil in particular, and oil extraction always comes with costs. And in a similar way, thinking about data, immaterial and in essence a very different resource than oil, obviously. That's why I think we all criticize this analogy today, but the negative externalities are there, and this is also where the balancing test should start. So I don't think anybody should have a precise answer to when we exceed, when quantity of data becomes too much, because it's very, very contextual, and that balancing test will look differently depending on the purpose. So for example, if we talk about online marketing, a business type of industry that has been extremely data driven and extremely data intensive, I would say for that type of purpose, which is not socially positive, it does not reward people, it does not serve people, it's even questioned by industry itself. There is a lot of research showing how flawed the whole behavioral advertising models are, and how, needless to say, they can be harmful for people, but for the companies themselves, it's even more questionable that they simply don't work. So for something that is socially questionable, potentially harmful for people, and even flawed in its essence, I would say any data is too much data, and that this balancing test will always fail as soon as you see any negative externalities. But if you replace behavioral targeting with curing cancer, doing research on people's behavior to, develop a better methods of treatment or better psychological treatment. So you need behavioral data again, but for an entirely different purpose. Now we are talking about a very different test. And so I wouldn't be even trying to identify the point in quantity that makes any sense, because it will always depend. What is less vague or where we could really put a finger on is what already Eline mentioned, quality of data. I think here we have quite strict guidelines already developed by research community, by academia, by authoritative bodies like British ICO, who issued recently last year very well developed guidelines on explainability of AI, arguing that we should aim for explainable AI whenever decisions affecting humans are present, and building on the amount of knowledge in the field we already have, we can identify certain red lines for the quality of data. So, for example, collecting data that is not relevant to the problem you want to solve should not be the case. If the problem you want to solve is, predict behavior of a convicted person, famous or infamous US example with predictive policing systems, with systems supporting or meant to support judges in making very difficult predictions about human beings. The problem here is relevance. We have scientists argue that it is simply impossible to predict the pattern of behavior for an individual, no matter what kind of data you have, but definitely you cannot do that just looking at historical data from the justice system, because then the best you can achieve is to repeat certain stereotypes, certain patterns of thinking. So irrelevant or confusing data, or data polluted with certain patterns of human thinking can only be dangerous, and collecting more of it will not help us solve the problem. Another aspect is accuracy. Again, Eline already mentioned that it is quite tricky to collect accurate data about human behavior. It's probably much easier to do that with cars. It's probably easier to do that with crops and weather. But when you discuss people, human behavior that is contextual, that depends on specific situation, including the very presence of the software collecting data that modifies human behavior by definition, you can very quickly end up with non-accurate, confusing data just because you have introduced a data collection system in the equation that wasn't there before, right? So these would be the parameters I would be looking at when deciding what type of data we need and whether that's always the most important question, whether data can help us solve a specific problem at all. But if the answer, data-driven answer is yes, if we can prove, if there is a proof of concept that indeed we have data to answer a certain question, I agree. Why not use it with safeguards that I believe we will discuss in the next round.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive answer. Yes, please, Eline, just jump in.
Thank you so much. I know it maybe is not conventional, but a lot of the things that you said just made me want to react, if I may. We may not agree on everything, but I think that's for the sake of the discussion, that could be very interesting. So I do concur with a few things you said regarding, I think, the limits between, where personal data begins and ends. So you have mixed data sets in certain situations that have both. In my work, I cover regulatory aspects of tech and legislative proposals of the European Commission, for instance. They came up with this European data strategy, and they are focusing on and even obsessing about data ownership, making sure data portability is going to be expanded, that there should be some common data spaces per sector, so that you facilitate not just the control and access of personal data by individuals themselves, but also facilitate the sharing of industrial data. But here's the catch. If you have a common data space, for instance, for financial services and one for healthcare, we know that these involve inevitably personal data, sensitive data, personal identifiable data. And that will lead to some sort of regulatory schizophrenia between, we have the GDPR on the one hand that does limit the collection, use, and repurposing of personal data, and that data strategy that will bring legislative proposals like the Data Acts and others on the table that will incentivize and encourage the sharing and the processing and the repurposing of that data. So that's one point that I wanted to make on really to complement that difficulty and that problem that it will be a problem in terms of legal clarity and certainty for companies in particular, and as to how can they use data. Also, there are many kinds of personal data that individuals themselves does not, cannot, and maybe should not even own. And one reason is that rather than one type of data, there are many millions of different data sets that cover different and unrelated things with different applications. And the pooling, the overlap, the cross-application of these data sets don't always make sense. It's like if you pull cow fertility data with power utility loading metrics and gas turbine telemetry and fortnight cohort analysis that may not be necessarily useful. So that's one thing. And another thing that I wanted to contribute is also when it comes to creating those data spaces and expanding those data portability rights. That has a cost for companies. I mean, data portability is good to some extent, that companies can propose more products, that consumers can maybe access different platforms and keep the same data, and it's in real time, it's much more convenient. But there's not necessarily evidence that consumers want those personal data spaces. And another point is, it's great to want to give more controls to users, individuals, But at the same time, if these people don't have the digital literacy to be able to know how to use those tools, where they are, if there's no guidance next to it, I mean, all these proposals are just going to be paper tigers. And one thing and final thing that I wanted to react on that I've heard you touch upon was, this discussion that really goes towards, so accuracy, I'm hearing maybe bias. And I've just read an op-ed this morning that talked about racist tech. I mean, that was the way it was framed, and I found it to be a little, it really reflects a misunderstanding, at least in my view, when it comes to bias and things like AI and technologies in general that are used just like we would hold humans to the standards of being biased and racist. Algorithmic bias is the tendency of an algorithm to produce results that have significant difference in accuracies in different groups. And if you look at it in that sense, there are many contexts in which algorithmic bias can be actually pretty much acceptable. If I go on Zalando and I buy clothes, my algorithm is biased so that it recommends maybe clothes.
If I can stop you, I think we will discuss it later on, and I haven't made that argument in the context of accuracy. I actually think that algorithmic bias is a solvable issue, and when I meant accuracy, I meant something else, rather simply non-accurate data about humans that modify their behavior as a result of a new factor introduced in the system, and data simply does not show us something that we try to see. I didn't mention bias in this context, so we don't have to discuss it now. I think we can do it later.
Yeah, thanks. Eline, would you like to finish? Yeah, yes?
No, I guess, well, I mean, there's a lot to say about this issue, but we can continue later then.
Well, I think that's very important. It's very interesting because we already have this kind of a real discussion where we can touch probably a common topic from different perspectives and from different point of view, probably. So I think that we do have agreement here that the quality of data probably would be the most important thing. But on the other hand, it was mentioned that the data should be only used if we have a goal, a good, probably good-hearted goal for usage of it. But just think about it, that with the digital uptake, with the Internet of Things, with the wearable technology, and et cetera, I think we are collecting a vast amount of data each second without probably knowing how it might be used further on, because it might be very useful solving very reasonable health issues that we are not trying to solve right now, this minute. But having the data in the future, it will allow us to solve it. So maybe the collection of the data, well, probably it's good in itself, and it would not stop. And I was thinking that should the personal data, because now we're really touching this personal data file, that this personal data used for public good, if the personal data is used for public good, maybe it's good, or it should be used for direct personal good as well. If it's my data, should I be the beneficiary of this data that I'm kind of giving up willingly or unwillingly for somebody to use? So Katarzyna, maybe we could start from your reaction back to the previous comments and just a little bit pick up on this as well.
Yes, no, I will start with your question. I think it's moving us forward in this discussion more than my reactions to what has been said before. Indeed, absolutely key question in the whole discussion here is who controls the data. If data is collected and stored just in case it might become useful in the future by private companies with their own commercial interest behind that, then it's not surprising that people are concerned, that governments are concerned, that data protection authorities are concerned. And the first question is, why do you do it? What is your legal purpose? According to GDPR, we always demand companies to indicate specifically their purpose and to go through a certain balancing test of necessity and proportionality. This is already built in the European law. These are old principles. GDPR has only re-established them. It's not invented 2 years ago. So as lawyers, we always look at whether specific data collection is necessary and proportionate for a specific purpose. Having said that, I said this to explain that it's it's legally, at least in the European law, unthinkable, unjustified to collect data just in case, because it might come handy in the future. If we want to go in this direction, if there is public interest, or there are politicians, decision makers believing there is public interest in doing so, namely in collecting data that we cannot use today, but we might find positive for the society ways of using them in the future, then comes the question how we do it. One way of doing it would be to avoid having this data personal. So collect only data that is either not linked to human beings, not describing individuals, not affecting individuals, or anonymized data using the whole world of knowledge on how to do it right, because anonymization is a tricky beast. It's not easy to effectively anonymize data. I will not go into details because I'm not data scientist myself, but I'm pretty sure that our viewers, listeners know where to find advice on data anonymization and appreciate how difficult it can be, but it can be done. So that's one approach. On the other hand, if we decide as a society that we want to have personal data stored for the future operations, then comes the whole discussion who should control it. One of the concepts that in our network of digital rights organizations gains a lot of traction and interest is creating new constructs for this, like data trusts that would be controlled not by companies, not by governments, but by multi-stakeholder bodies that ensure that exactly the level of trust is higher and that potential for abuse is lower. We don't have yet ready legal constructs to introduce data trust in Europe. It is a common law-based concept. So again, it will take some discussion how to transfer it, but that could be an interesting direction. That on one hand, we agreed to take more risk regarding the collection of personal data for the future. But on the other hand, we built in the system legal and technical safeguards preventing or lowering the risk of abusing such data, for example, for narrow-minded short-term commercial purposes. I know it's quite abstract. We're talking on a general level. It would be probably easier to take a case to discuss, but that would be the principle that we discuss in our network. One case that we can look at today and very present in this discussion, I believe, is the COVID-19 and collection of data to help fight a pandemic, or at least track the virus. This case has been very useful, at least in my opinion. We've moved in the discussion in Europe from let's collect it all, let's look at personal data, let's employ every technology we have to observe human behavior in this context, to solutions that are very privacy friendly, basically using only anonymous data. I refer now to the standard that was finally adopted by Google and Apple for COVID tracking apps, and effectively also imposed on governments. In this standard, you actually don't use personal data because it turned out not to be necessary, right? So even in the context of quite urgent, quite alarming cause, where that appetite for collecting more, storing for the future, maybe for the next pandemic to come, has been curbed by I think quite successful collaboration of data protection authorities, researchers, watchdog organizations like us, and surprisingly also big tech companies that in this particular conversation presented social responsibility. And at the end of the day, we have solutions that might be useful. It's not for me to judge, I'm not epidemiologist, and do not expose people's privacy and do not lead to collection of personal data just in case. So that example shows that we can at least try to tackle serious societal challenges without collecting data just in case, especially personal data, unless, as I said before, we find a better legal vehicles for this and effective safeguards preventing risks that will emerge. Undoubtedly, we will have these issues.
Yes, thank you. Eline, would you like to jump in this as well, to continue on that? And I think that another aspect has already been touched in this question and previous one is GDPR. I think, do you think that's enough for us to have it? I mean, and we can survive in today's world with that?
It's an interesting discussion that we had to have with the crisis, right? So there's been this discussion on how to maintain or strike a balance between using technologies to help tackle health crisis and safeguard privacy at the same time. And I think citizens have really shown that they're willing and ready to make concessions to some of their liberties and freedoms in particular circumstances. But some worry that what we accept during the health crisis may end up integrating the common law, or that data sets could be put to other uses in the future. I think the EDPS expressed some also concerns regarding, temperature checking in Brussels, etc. So there's really an importance that for these applications to be effective, that there's public trust, and that means that people know that data will be protected by appropriate security measures. And at the same time, you have, and I'm quoting a German politician, and I forgot his name, but he said something like, anyone who makes data protection and health protection something like mutually exclusive options is actually prolonging the crisis at a very high price. So there's this sort of very difficult dilemmas or discussions that have been happening. Now, the European data protection rules, they do limit that processing of personal data, but they do allow for public health exceptions in the context of pandemics with certain limits and safeguards. But not all measures proposed in European countries have necessarily met those limits. So some people would argue that the GDPR is not enough to protect privacy, and that the debate over the use of location data in particular settings, it's really a forerunner to a broader discussion about civil liberties and surveillance. And others have also argued that a lack of a common approach for data sharing would limit and would have limited the ability of researchers to act in the current context. And then you have other examples outside Europe where you have China that has been more extreme on an effective use of the technology at the expense of privacy. Now, we know that we have safeguards in Europe that include pseudonymization, aggregation, encryption, decentralization. But it's true that anonymized data can never be totally anonymous. And in many cases, it's not necessarily secure because there is a risk that it can be traced back to personal data, but it is known as one of the common safeguards. So it is true that in some instances, the GDPR, some people are still debating whether that was either a limit to using data in the crisis or, something that was useful to protect certain privacy concerns and safeguards to privacy. I just wanted to maybe get back to the point of some tech companies working with governments. I think what has been an interesting example is this French Stop COVID application. You see that in Finland, actually, the app seems to be, the COVID app seems to be working rather well. I think it's 20% of the population that downloaded the app within the first day. But in France, you see that it's only been sending 70 or so notifications to at-risk users, and very few people have been adopting it. Some people call it a technological caprice, that a lot of money has been wasted and we don't even know when we stop using it, etc. But really the issue isn't about whether or not we should spend resources on these apps. I think they can be useful. It's more about the approach and how countries have gone about in building them. And sometimes the governments in the public sector just isn't necessarily taking reasonable decisions. And strangely enough, you have governments like France or even Germany. They asked companies like Apple and Google to relax their privacy rules on contact tracing and to turn off their privacy protections, which goes against years of European rhetoric, casting tech companies as the bad guys when it comes to data privacy. So I think there could have been better decisions made at the level of the public sector, and it shows how much there needs to be some sort of a catch up in that area. One way, just a final point, just as a side note, one way we could definitely increase the collection and use of data for the benefit of individuals, but also businesses, because it's something I focus also on my work more the innovation side of it, is the use of data trust, because securing, making sure access and sharing of data is secure, cyber secure, but also privacy secure, and protects trade secrets. You need to have better infrastructure that enables that exchange. And we still haven't developed that very well in Europe yet. We have the UK that has tested data trusts, so the sort of mechanisms that can really help address issues of data quality, security, and privacy, and protect companies' intellectual property. And I think that could be very useful to encourage private and non-profit sectors to provide voluntary access to high-quality data as well.
Okay, thank you so
much. May I react to on the GDPR question as well?
Yes, of course. I just will make a very short comment that this Corona app used in France, actually, I've got a number that it only had alerted 14 people. You said 70, 14, but I mean...
I've read 72.
70, but in any case, I mean, well, that's probably not a huge amount.
No.
Having the population of France, and well, it also brought me thoughts. Does it bring value? I mean, this app, using app, giving up some privacy, and then you have only less than 100 people alert with that. But just
it's valuable if it has critical mass. So the less people adopted,
exactly. Yeah. So it did not pick up. Yes, Katarzyna, please going back to GDPR.
Well, also quickly reacting on apps, since you brought that point. I know it's easy target for all of us to almost laugh at, because this experiment clearly fails in scale. But I can also understand why so many governments took the risk. It was clearly an experiment. Nobody was hiding it at the point in time when these apps were enrolled. The consensus that we have seen emerging in Europe was that since it is experimental, since we don't know what will be the uptake and what will be the impact on actually managing the crisis, therefore, we need to raise the bar for safeguards and protect privacy to the maximum level, exactly to avoid the negative externalities I mentioned before. And if you see this experiment from that perspective, that privacy has not been exposed, that actually people have not been tracked in a way that they are usually tracked online, because these apps are not collecting personal data, right? So they're very different in that aspect from typical online services that we all know and some of us don't like, including myself. If you take that into account, you can look at failed experiment from the perspective of mislocated public money or mislocated time of state authorities, but not privacy, fortunately, wasn't at stake to the extent that it could have been had we have real tracking apps that were contemplated by many governments at the beginning of this conversation. So that's on this is a quick comment on contact tracing apps and this whole experiment. And back to GDPR and your question whether this is enough. Again, in our digital rights network, there is a strong consensus that not. We are still big fans of the GDPR, even if we see that after almost 3 years of that law being in operation, there are still many unsolved questions. Regardless of this observation, we think GDPR should stay in its current form, should not be reopened, because that creates huge political and legislative risks for citizens in particular, because the lobbying power behind further diluting principles would be huge, I think, at that point in time. So I'm not saying at all the GDPR should be reopened as a political project, but fortunately, we have EU aiming with full speed at a different legal reform orientated towards large platforms and solving the specific problems for our privacy, and not only for our privacy, also for democracy, for many other aspects of our life, problems caused by online platforms with specific focus on large platforms. I'm talking about the Digital Services Act and the whole package coming with this legislation. And this is a very good opportunity, together with horizontal AI legislation, to fill certain gaps that we see left after the GDPR reform. And these gaps relate to non-personal data in particular. So as we already, I think, have shown in this discussion, a lot can be done with non-personal data. And non-personal data can be very useful for policymaking. And still there can be questions on securing this data, on the accuracy of this data, on the legitimacy of using this data, on social cost of using also non-personal data. So one area where we need more guidance is non-personal data. For example, whether any company can plug any sensor anywhere in the field or in the forest or in somebody's space, physical space, in order to collect data or not. These questions need to be solved. On the other hand, algorithmic decision-making that affects human beings is also often driven by non-personal data. So again, my example with online advertising that I specifically criticize because I have strong concerns about this field. Behavioral advertising very often or always is driven by statistical models, by big data that describe not only my behavior, but behavior of other people. But at the end, I am affected by content recommendation that might be confusing for me or abusive, by an ad that might play with my vulnerabilities, by a discriminatory pricing or any other offer that might affect my rights. Even though it was driven by non-personal data, the harm is on me. And these types of situations in a more serious context, like public policy, judiciary decisions, medical decisions, recruitment decisions, can be plenty. So we have to solve this problem, which is not yet solved by the GDPR. And looking at these two areas and probably more, we certainly need more legislation in this area. I'm sorry to say it because I'm also not a big fan of coming up with new regulations, but I think it's a given that we will have new regulations.
Thank you so much. That were very interesting points, I think. Well, we already also touched kind of this public and private collaboration and gathering data and building evidence and, I don't know, using the data for something. And you also touched this in a way that there's a problem. There's a problem probably when the company is not really obliged to, or not really regulated to the full, not to abuse the data. And in some cases, it might happen that a private company might overrun the government in a sense. We saw this happening probably in the United States with some social platforms back in the day. There are some other examples of that. And as I understand, you would say that GDPR kind of misses this regulation in Europe for the time being, with a better proposition of using this, of collecting this data that might be not really attributed to a person, but using it in a ethical sense.
Well, GDPR does not concern non-personal data at all. So it by definition, it cannot solve this problem. This is problem beyond GDPR. Yes,
exactly. Eline, would you like to contribute on that as well?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go back to Katarzyna's point on the GDPR being enough or not, because I think some, at least my organization was one of those that has been arguing for saying how GDPR actually has limited the adoption of tools like those COVID apps. And because according to the GDPR, people have to give their consent to a functionality of an app separately, and that proximity data should or can only be used with the user's consent, and actually leaving it up to individual users to choose to opt in such an app could be a problem, because the only way this type of app, as we discussed, can reach a critical mass and be efficient if enabled by default, so that it facilitates really the collection of that data if we're talking about COVID apps. And other people have been discussing how, the principle of data minimization that we find in the GDPR may lose some of its preeminence after COVID, because now you have in a debate an increasing recognition that access to data is invaluable to protecting public health. So I wonder how that could be opened up for other disease cases. Will it be rolled back for COVID? Will we go back to how it was? Or, will they be really a change in one of those principles of the GDPR, that is data minimization, for example? Now, we did not have a position on this, but I'm just saying that could be something that policymakers and lawmakers will be discussing. And I think regarding did you want me to react to another point that Katarzyna brought up?
Yes, please do.
Because I think, I'm not sure was it about the use of, it was some case in the US, I'm not exactly sure. Was it about algorithmic bias this time?
I think the last question was about the companies collecting non-personal data and how that relates to GDPR. But maybe before we go into that question, if you still want to do it, let me react on what Eline just said about the GDPR, because I think it is important for me as a European lawyer. I have to do it. I have to correct it. Not at all. GDPR has 7 legal grounds, where consent is only one of them, and specifically for public uses of data, for health-related uses, we should consider different legal grounds. So this is not true that the only way for a COVID tracing or tracking app to work is through opt-in. Not at all. We can certainly imagine a different legal ground. All it takes is the proportionality and necessity test to be passed. And that was the problem in most of the cases, because we already discussed it, I will not repeat it, how many controversies there are around these apps, to what extent this type of data will be useful or not, to what extent that level of tracing is necessary or not. But if we have these arguments solved, the answer would be yes, then there is no legal controversy with a specific state legislating on an app like this and choosing a different legal ground for such an app, simply saying this is necessary for public health purposes or necessary for any other real reason, and therefore avoiding the individual opt-in. So this is not true that according to GDPR, we need to go through opt-in, not at all. We as GDPR liking lawyers actually argue against this, because we hate the fact how individual consent is abused by companies and sometimes even governments. Let's not be mistaken on this. It's only one of 7 legal grounds and not the most important one.
Okay, thanks. I see that actually we are going already close with the time. So I thought that we have probably a lot of points to discuss here, but I think that it will be already a time to do a closing round. And well, in this case, we would probably need to zoom out of some details that we've been discussing already for almost an hour. And I have an example that I would like you to share your view at. It's about Brazil. It's about Latin America's largest democracy. That it was a leader on data governance for many years. Even at 2018, Brazil's Congress passed the data protection law, which they called LGPD. It's closely modeled on European GDPR. And recently, though, the country took a more authoritarian path. Even before the pandemic, they began creating an extensive data collection and surveillance infrastructure. In October 2018, President signed a decree compelling all federal bodies to share most of the data they hold on Brazilian citizens, from health records to biometric information, consolidated in a vast master database, with no public debate, with no public consultation. They took this measure by surprise. So they say that it hopes to increase the quality and consistency of the data it holds. It could improve public services, cut down on voter fraud, reduce bureaucracy. In a country with 210 million people, a system would speed up a delivery of social welfare services, tax benefits, public policies would be more efficient. But on the other hand, critics warned that under the far-right leadership, this concentration of data will be used to abuse personal privacy and civil liberties. And that's happening with the largest democracy in Latin America. Would you share your view on that? Because probably we can have a discussion what's happening here in Europe, but the world is broader than that, and there are more streams of thought, more policies, and more realities than we've been discussing right now. Could you please elaborate on what is happening? Do you see a perspective that many countries would take on this path with current situation of a pandemic, which really gives a power to politicians to act more in a more radical way? I don't know, maybe Eline, could we start from you with that?
My take on your question would be, in general, I think when you have a crisis in a very uncertain environment and context, and we've seen how freedoms and liberties have been challenged in recent months, I can see how our democratic institutions are more fragile or have been fragilized, and maybe, you know, there is opportunity for certain types of rules to emerge. I mean, we've seen that in Europe as well. The contribution that I can make to your point that maybe is relevant to what I do in my work is that we see that, I mean, some see that sort of push from Europe itself with certain types of regulations, including GDPR, that some companies, that some economic regions don't really like to see emerge. That, you know, we've heard how things like the GDPR or a legal framework for AI with more requirements on certain companies could limit innovation, could limit data flows, and that Brussels is really trying to put a regulatory stamp on many things because it believes that global markets will follow its lead. And I think not everyone is looking at us, you know, with the confidence that it is going in the right direction. And in general, I think government officials don't necessarily spend enough time thinking through the actual practical effect. How much is this regulation? It looks good on paper, but how much is it going to cause the company to implement? What are going to be practical outcomes? What kinds of what is the cost-benefit analysis of bringing in this piece of regulation? What does it mean for the rest of the world? For instance, you have a lot of countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia moving ahead with data localization as a strategy. And data localization is the enemy of the digital economy because it limits free flow of data, which is not something that it necessarily is good for competitiveness of companies. So I think we have to continue to think we are in a global data market and we're in a global economy that doesn't really know borders. So something that can happen in Brazil or in Europe and it can have an impact on other regions. I hope that answers your question. I wasn't quite sure how to react, but.
Okay, thank you very much. Katarzyna, would you like to collaborate on that as well?
Thank you. Indeed, it is difficult to comment on Brazilian situation without knowing more details about current context. I do remember 5 years back how optimistic we were as the network of digital rights activists about Brazil coming up with GDPR-like legislation. I know a lot has changed in the meantime, but I'm not quite updated with how wrong or how far from the ideal scenario Brazil has moved in terms of legislation. So it's not for me to judge the quality of that legislation. Looking at politics of this country, certainly I would also have concerns whether, no matter what the law applies, whether the government will not abuse the information it has. But this is the never-ending discussion, the never-ending battle we have in each and every democracy. In that sense, the pandemic only fuels the same political process that we've been observing since ever. It's not a new struggle that people need to stay alerted. People need to continue fighting for their rights because nobody else will do it for them. And certainly there will be companies and governments willing to abuse power over data if we give it to them, but we don't have to. Obviously, it's easier said than done when you talk about more authoritarian states, looking at Asia, looking at Russia, not certain, as I said, about Brazil, whether we can compare, put Brazil in the same row, but certainly in authoritarian regimes, I'm not putting any blame on people for not reacting. I understand how limited their ability to act is, and I don't have any clever advice on how to solve this issue because this is entirely beyond our discussion today. I can only say that here in Europe, where we still believe to have democratic processes in place, it is partly on us as citizens to remain interested, to remain in the debate, to remain alerted, and do not fall into easy solutions like let's collect it all because we are so afraid of the pandemic or the next one to come. We really have more, back to the title of our discussion, evidence to help us work with this fear, work with this easy emotions and question certain premises. I think COVID-19 was a very good case showing how that shift in the discussion was possible. Yes, we started with this concept, data will save us, AI will save us, let's feed it with more data, but quite quickly, these premises have been questioned, have been undermined. Effectively, we implemented solutions across Europe that are quite privacy friendly, that do not collect everything that could have been collected. So even within this last 6 months, we have learned something, right? Which shows that democracy has certain mechanisms built in order to prevent this negative scenario that you described talking about Brazil. But really, I cannot make any judgments on to what extent Brazilian society currently is in place to put up such a fight and put reasonable limitations on the data collection that happens there.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, probably I took it by surprise asking this question, but probably what I was looking for from both of you is reassurance that, well, Europe can be in a good democratic path of these issues. Please, Eline.
Yeah, because maybe your question was also about whether, because we have the GDPR, we can make sure that we, I mean, the EU wants to make sure it holds countries to its own standards. So will it do the same perhaps with Brazil, if that's maybe a reaction that we want the EU to have? But I would like to be provocative here because I know there's been this, you know, it's a difficult thing that's happening with the US-EU Privacy Shield on the grounds that the US government would be using personal data of Europeans for surveillance purposes, and so that the US wouldn't necessarily be up to the GDPR standards. But what is interesting is the EU has adequacy with a few countries, has given adequacies to a few countries. It's a long process, it's uncertain. Even the UK is not sure to be granted adequacy, even though it is, you know, as an ex-EU member, it has been implementing and respecting the GDPR. And at the same time, you have Israel that has adequacy, but the country recently came under fire because they've allowed the police to use Israel's anti-terrorism location tracking system to track COVID-positive individuals' mobile phones without their consent. And the EU hasn't necessarily said, well, maybe we should reconsider or reevaluate Israel for adequacy. At least I haven't heard. And then you also have the GDPR that allows companies to transfer EU data to China using legal mechanisms like binding corporate rules and standard contractual clauses, even though companies are subjected to laws like China's national intelligence law that can force them to hand over data to the Chinese government. So I think there's maybe some sort of double standards here and there. The EU is not necessarily consistent with the way in which it implements the GDPR. So I don't know whether, and I don't know again as well, I don't know either enough about the Brazil example, but if maybe that's a 2 cents that I can bring to the table.
We had a very good discussion. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.